Following the victory in the Battle of Normandy, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery proposed a single push northwards towards the Lower Rhine River to enable the British Second Army to pass the Siegfried Line safely and attack the Ruhr, one of Germany's most important industrial areas. The First Allied Airborne Army was tasked with capturing important bridges along the route of the Second Army. But the mission soon turned into the creepiest battle of World War II when the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps attacked the small British force that was present at a bridge in Arnhem, Netherlands. Outnumbered and short on supplies, a handful of British soldiers fought valiantly for 9 days, resisting the heavy attack by the Wehrmacht and buying valuable time for the Allied forces. Watch this video until the very end to find out what happened in the creepiest battle of World War II and learn about how the British 1st Airborne Division valiantly fought a much bigger German force for 9 days. By September 1944, the Allied forces had successfully passed the Normandy hurdle and pursued the scattered German forces through France and Belgium. Normally, the Allied leadership favored a broad front strategy to push deeper into Germany. However, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery suggested an aggressive approach to move northward through Dutch Gelderland, bypassing the German Siegfried Line defenses and opening a route to the Ruhr, the German industrial hub. Originally planned to include only the British and Polish troops, the strategy of the operation that was codenamed Comet quickly grew to include the majority of the First Allied Airborne Army and a major ground assault into the Netherlands, codenamed Market Garden. Montgomery's strategy included dropping the US 101st Airborne Division to seize bridges around Eindhoven, the US 82nd Airborne Division to take over crossings around Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne Division, along with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade to take control of 3 bridges over the Niederrhein at Arnhem. Although Lieutenant General Louis Brereton was in charge of the First Allied Airborne Army, his second-in-command, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, was commanding the airborne operation. The plan was that the British Second Army, under the command of XXX Corps, would push forward along the airborne corridor, securing the positions of the airborne divisions. It was decided that the army would cross the Rhine within 2 days, and if the operation was successful, it would open a doorway to Germany and bring an end to the bloodiest war in history. The 1st Airborne Division, led by Major General Roy Urquhart, was responsible for securing the Rhine bridgehead. This division comprised 3 infantry brigades, supporting artillery from the 1st Air Landing Light Regiment, anti-tank units, Royal Engineer groups, and supporting elements such as the Royal Army Medical Corps and Royal Army Service Corps. Additionally, it included the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, a Dutch commando group, and American communication teams. The 1st Airborne Division was considerably reinforced with 1,200 men from the Glider Pilot Regiment who would transport infantry and vehicles to Arnhem. The division's mission was to secure the road, rail, and pontoon bridges across the Niederrhein at Arnhem and maintain control over them for 2 to 3 days until the arrival of the XXX Corps. But Operation Comet started facing challenges before it even started. For example, the US 15th Troop Carrier Command, led by Major General Williams, was unable to land all airborne troops simultaneously. Seeing this problem, Williams decided to do 1 airlift per day. This meant it would take 3 days to land the division and Polish brigade at Arnhem. The area around Arnhem was not ideal for glider landings, and Williams was reluctant to send the aircraft too close to Arnhem. To secure the bridges, towns, and drop zones for future supply missions, the 1st Airborne Division had to defend an 18 miles area while waiting for the XXX Corps. According to Allied intelligence, the 1st Airborne Division was expected to receive limited German resistance. Because of this intelligence, several soldiers thought their efforts would end the Second World War. Some were even expecting a German occupation and included recreational gear in their supplies or aboard the Sea Tail. Major Brian Urquhart, Browning's intelligence officer, gathered intel from the 21st Army Group in Belgium and the Dutch resistance, indicating the presence of German tanks around Arnhem. This was also confirmed through aerial reconnaissance missions he had ordered. Browning, however, was skeptical and directed his top medical officer to send Urquhart on sick leave. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, knew it was highly likely there were 2 Panzer divisions at Arnhem, but decided to ignore them as the operation was about to begin. The Allied liberation of Antwerp on September 4, 1944 had led to a major German retreat. Instead of pursuing the Wehrmacht's dispersed troops, the Allied army stopped at the Dutch border, which allowed the Germans to regroup. Field Marshal Walter Model, in command of Army Group B, relocated his headquarters to Arnhem and began to rebuild defenses in the region, coordinating the reorganization of the dispersed German units. So, by the time the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, several German units were resisting them. To the west of Arnhem was Kampfgruppe von Tettau, under the command of General Hans von Tettau at Heberberg. It was equivalent to 7 battalions and comprised a mix of German forces, including Army, Air Force, Navy, and Waffen-SS troops. This included the SS Non-Commissioned Officer School SS Unteroffizierschule Arnhem and the 16th SS Training Battalion, commanded by SS Sturmbannführer Steppkraft, who played a key role in the battle's initial stages. Within Arnhem, the town garrison was under the command of Major General Friedrich Kusen. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, made up of the remains of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, had moved into the area north of Arnhem to regroup. Despite suffering heavy losses in Normandy and during their escape from the Falaise pocket, the Corps was made up of experienced veterans, providing the Germans with significantly more forces than the Allies were expecting. Both divisions were also specially trained in anti-airborne operations. During their formation, both divisions underwent month-long anti-airborne training and had spent the previous 15 months studying the best responses to parachute attacks through both classroom and field exercises. The 9th SS had a Panzer Grenadier Brigade, a reconnaissance battalion, an artillery battalion, 2 batteries of self-propelled guns, and a tank company. Additionally, there were Dutch units allied to the Germans present at Arnhem. These formations were made up of Dutch nationals. As the battle began, the German forces received more and more reinforcements. Hitler was shocked by the attack, but decided that protecting the Netherlands was of utmost importance. Every day of the conflict saw the German military power grow, while the British resources dwindled. As a result, by September 21, 1944, the 5th day of the conflict, the German forces outnumbered the British troops 3-1. The first lift of the British 1st Airborne Division was followed by a series of intense bombings and air attacks by the British 2nd Tactical Air Force and the American 8th and 9th Air Forces. These attacks targeted the anti-aircraft positions and German military bases and barracks in the area. The first lift suffered few casualties as the planes and gliders made their way from British bases to the target location. The British soldiers group to first arrive was the 21st Independent Parachute Company, which landed at 12:40 in the areas designated for the gliders and paratroopers of the main force. This landing was quite smooth, and the battalions were organized efficiently and prepared to begin their missions by 14:45. The Air Landing Brigade secured the landing areas, and the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, moved into Wolfheze, whereas the 1st Battalion, Border Regiment, took over DZX, spreading its companies throughout the area and in Renkum. At the same time, the Dutch SS Watch Battalion was moving from Ada to Arnhem. The Air Landing Brigade ambushed them, resulting in several Axis casualties. As the 1st Air Landing Brigade moved away from the landing zones, the 1st Parachute Brigade got ready to move east towards the bridges, with Brigadier Gerald Lathbury and his HQ company following Frost on the Lion route. Despite losing some of their jeeps during the flight, the company regrouped and proceeded along the Leopard route. The Germans were caught off guard by the landings. Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model mistakenly assumed that the paratroopers aimed to capture him, so he escaped from his base at Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterberg and moved to Bittrich's headquarters east of Arnhem in Doetinchem, where he controlled the battle from. The 10th SS Panda Division was dispatched south to counter the American landings at Nijmegen and protect the island, a polder between the Niederrhein and Waal rivers, whereas the 9th SS Panzer Division was ordered to defend Arnhem. The 9th SS Panzer Division was in the process of readying for a return to Germany, while Heinz Harmel was in Berlin trying to get more troops and supplies for his unit. He was immediately called back to Arnhem as his division began to prepare for the fight. Obersturmbannführer Ludwig Spindler, leading the 9th SS Armored Artillery Regiment, quickly put together a small battle group or Kampfgruppe Spindler. It was initially made up of only 120 men, but would later include 16 units. The 9th SS Division's 40-vehicle reconnaissance battalion, under the leadership of Hauptsturmführer Victor Grebner, was ordered south to Nijmegen and made its way across Arnhem at sunset. Initially, no units were assigned to guard the bridge because Kusen, the commander of the Arnhem garrison, was killed by the 3rd Parachute Battalion as he made his way to his headquarters, leading to a collapse in German command. But in the late afternoon, the reconnaissance battalion of the 10th SS Panzer Division was ordered to secure the bridge. At the moment of the landings, the only organized German force prepared to resist the Allied advance towards the bridge was the 16th SS Training Battalion, which was stationed in Wolfhesse. The battalion commander, Sepp Kraft, quickly established a defensive barrier west of Osterberg. The Allied advance quickly encountered difficulties, with the reconnaissance group being caught in a surprise attack by the northern flank of Kraft's blocking line. The 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions also faced resistance from Kraft's defences and spent the remainder of the day moving around his lines. The 3rd Parachute Battalion moved south and stopped at Osterberg for much of the night, while the 1st Parachute Battalion continued north but was met by Spindler's troops and couldn't make it to the Arnhem road of the Leopard route. The only battalion that was largely unopposed was the 2nd Parachute Battalion, which managed to bypass the defences that hadn't extended as far as the river. However, the cheering Dutch civilians slowed their advance, and the battalion reached the bridges late in the day. The 9th SS Panzer Division kept reinforcing the German defensive line. Kraft's group moved out at night and joined Spindler's forces, coming under his leadership. As more and more soldiers and units were arriving at the front, Spindler's army force became so large that he had to divide his forces into smaller battle groups known as Kampfgruppen Alvorden and Harder. The defensive line now covered the western edge of Arnhem and had successfully filled in the gap left by frost along the river the night before. During the night, the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions managed to get as close as the 2nd Parachute Battalion's initial Lion route. Hoping to reach Arnhem Center, they got close to the German lines just before dawn and for several hours tried to break through the German defenses. However, Spindler's forces, which were being constantly reinforced, were too powerful to overcome, and by 10 a.m. the British push was halted. A more organized attack was launched in the afternoon, but it also failed. Urquhart tried to get back to his division's headquarters at Osterberg, but got trapped and had to seek refuge in a loft with a Dutch family and 2 other officers. At the road bridge, the German 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion surrounded the 2nd Battalion, cutting them off from the rest of the British forces. By around 9 a.m., the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion was making its way back to Arnhem from the south, after deciding it was unnecessary to remain at Nijmegen. Seeing the presence of British forces at the bridge, the battalion made an attempt to storm it. In a grueling 2-hour conflict, they were defeated, suffering heavy casualties. 12 of the battalion's 20 armoured vehicles used in the attack were either destroyed or damaged, and their commander, Victor Grabner, was killed. The German assaults continued around the British perimeter at the Arnhem Bridge throughout the day, but the British managed to hold their position. By morning, the German forces started to test the defences of the 1st Air Landing Brigade. Kampfgruppen von Tettau attacked the positions of the border, while SS NCO school personnel took over Renkum, and Kriegsmarine troops clashed with the British throughout the day as they retreated. When the 4th Parachute Brigade, led by Brigadier Hackett, arrived after 3 p.m., they faced heavy enemy fire. Several soldiers were killed as both aircraft and parachutists were shot down, and the land they were supposed to land on was burned. However, the arrival of the 4th Parachute Brigade caught the Dutch SS off guard, who were overwhelmed and eventually surrendered. The situation in Arnhem was quickly changing, and the initial roles of the assembled units were redefined. The 11th Parachute Battalion and the rest of the South Staffords were immediately dispatched to Arnhem to support the effort to break through to the bridge. After dark, they joined forces with the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions. The 10th and 156th Parachute Battalions moved north of the railway line to establish their defensive positions northwest of Arnhem. However, the leading elements of the 156th Parachute Battalion came into contact with the main 9th SS Panzer Division's blocking line after dark and retreated for the night. The first supply drop was made onto a zone not under British control, and only a limited amount could be collected. The ground forces couldn't alert the RAF about the situation either because of the poor radio communication. As the South Staffords and the 11th Parachute Battalion moved into areas around the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions on the western edges of Arnhem, the British aimed to gather enough forces to break through Frost's position near the bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Doby, leading the 1st Parachute Battalion, intended to launch the assault before dawn, but a false report that the bridge had been destroyed postponed the operation. When the attack began, it was nearing dawn, and as soon as it was light, the 1st Parachute Battalion was detected and stopped by attacks from the main German defensive line. Caught in the open and under attack from all sides, the 1st Parachute Battalion disintegrated and the 3rd Parachute Battalion retreated. To the north of the railway tracks, the 156th and 10th Parachute Battalions attempted to capture the high ground in the forest north of Oosterbeek, but their progress was slow, and by early afternoon they had not moved beyond their starting positions. Realizing the need to retreat and prevent the 2 battalions from being isolated north of the railway, Urquhart directed them to withdraw to Wolfhese and Oosterbeek, but they were pursued by German soldiers of Kampfgruppe Kraft. Fighting began as the gliders landed in the middle of the withdrawal, resulting in significant Polish casualties. All the Allied forces moved south and west towards the road crossings over the steep railway gap at Oosterbeek and Wolfhese. Some German forces followed them across the railway, and an SS battalion reached Wolfhese, but stopped when the Luftwaffe began attacking the retreating Allied troops. In the afternoon, the RAF conducted its first major supply drop, with 164 aircraft transporting 390 short tons of supplies. The Germans were prepared for the drop and positioned 5 flak batteries in the area. Upon the RAF's approach, they shot down 10 aircraft. The British force could not reach the supplies as the drop zone was under German control, and there was no communication to explain the situation either. Frost continued to hold out, but without supplies or reinforcements, the situation became increasingly unstable. The Germans systematically began to demolish the houses the British were occupying, using tanks, artillery, and mortars. Luftwaffe also participated in attacks on these houses. By this point, the 1st Airborne Division was too exhausted to attempt to reach Frost at the bridge. 8 out of the 9 infantry battalions were severely damaged or scattered, with only the 1st Battalion, the Border Regiment, remaining intact. In a difficult decision by Urquhart, the 2nd Parachute Battalion was left on its own. By setting up a defensive circle around Oosterbeek and securing the Driel ferry crossing, Urquhart aimed to withstand the Germans until XXX Corps could arrive and create a new bridgehead across the Rhine. The afternoon supply drop was less successful than the day before. Despite a message being received in Britain about a new dropping zone near the Hotel Hartenstein, some planes flew to the old dropping zone where their supplies were captured by the Germans. At Oosterbeek, the Germans had used British marker panels and flares to lure the planes to their positions, making it hard for the pilots to identify the correct dropping zones. Out of 164 aircraft involved, 10 were downed around Arnhem, and only 13% of the supplies made it to British control. At the bridge, Frost finally established radio contact with Urquhart and received the grim news that the reinforcements were unlikely. Shortly after, at approximately 13:30, Frost was injured in his legs by a mortar bomb, and command was handed over to Major Gough. Despite their fierce defense of the buildings they still occupied, by late afternoon the British position was becoming increasingly precarious. When many of the buildings used for treating the wounded caught fire, a 2-hour ceasefire was arranged in the late afternoon, during which the wounded, including Frost, were captured. Overnight, a few units managed to hold out for a bit longer, and a few groups attempted to break out towards the Oosterbeek perimeter, though nearly all of them, including Major Hibbert, were captured. By 5 a.m. on Thursday morning, all resistance at the bridge had stopped. In later years, Walter Harzer claimed that, during the final hours of the fighting, his men intercepted a radio message sent from the bridge that concluded with the sentences, "Out of ammunition, God save the King." In the early hours, the Germans eliminated any remaining British soldiers and those who had managed to hide near the Arnhem Bridge. It took a lot of time to remove all the wreckage from the bridge so that German tanks could pass through and strengthen Nijmegen. The British needed to keep the bridge under their control for long enough for the 82nd Airborne Division and the Guards Armoured Division to seize control of the Nijmegen Bridge. After successfully eliminating the opposition at the bridge, the Germans were able to deploy additional forces for the battle at Oosterbeek. But this situation quickly shifted in the afternoon. The parachute infantry battalions of Stanislav Sosabowski's 1st Parachute Brigade finally arrived to reinforce the British troops. This relieved the pressure on the British and forced the Germans to send more troops south of the Rhine. During the night, the German forces south of the river established a defensive line along the railway, connecting with the 10th SS to the south and protecting the road bridge from the advancing Polish forces. However, the Polish positions at Driel were well fortified, making it difficult for German tanks to move off the main roads to launch an attack. The morale of the British soldiers rose when 3 armoured cars from XXX Corps' Household Cavalry successfully evaded the German defences on the island and joined forces with Sosabowski's troops. This was quickly followed by the arrival of tanks from the 4th and 7th Royal Dragoon Guards and infantry from the 5th Battalion Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry after sunset. The remaining units of the 43rd Wessex Division were advancing through a narrow passage behind them. Spindler was ordered to move his attacks further south to push the British out of the area, cutting off any possibility of reinforcements. Although they failed to achieve this objective, the constant artillery fire and attacks weakened the British defences. A brief break in the weather allowed the RAF to launch their first combat missions against the German forces encircling Urquhart's troops. South of the river, the Poles were readying for another attempt at crossing. That evening, they were expecting assault boats from XXX Corps, but these boats did not show up until after midnight, and many of them were missing oars. The crossing started at 3 a.m., with support from the 43rd Wessex Division providing fire. However, throughout the night, only 153 men managed to cross, a fraction of the reinforcements hoped for. In Oosterbeek, the circumstances were dire. Hackett suffered injuries in the early hours and was forced to relinquish command of the Eastern forces. The RAF tried to provide close support, but their efforts were largely in vain as shelling and sniper fire escalated the number of casualties each hour. The relief stations were occupied by 2,000 soldiers, including British, German, and Dutch civilians. Given that many of these stations were located on the front lines, in houses seized earlier in the conflict, a peculiar situation emerged where the wounded were often moved forward instead of being evacuated back. That evening, the Allies on the southern bank of the river attempted another crossing. The strategy involved the 4th Battalion, the Dorset Regiment, and the 1st Polish Parachute Battalion to cross at 2200 using boats and DUKWs. Sosabowski was furious at the prospect of losing command of one of his battalions and considered the plan risky but was overruled. The boats did not arrive until 1 a.m., with several being destroyed or lost on the way. In a sudden alteration of plans, only the Dorset Regiment was ordered to cross. The small boats, lacking experienced crews, the powerful current, and an ill-chosen landing spot on the north bank resulted in only a handful of the 315 men making it to the other side. The DUKWs and most boats landed too far downstream, leading to the capture of at least 200 men. During the night, a copy of the withdrawal strategy was sent across the river to Urquhart. Despite the clearly frustrating content, Urquhart knew he didn't have any other option but to save his troops. He contacted Thomas at 8 a.m. and agreed to the strategy with the condition that it be executed that evening. The airborne troops would have to endure an additional day within their defensive line. Throughout the day, additional personnel were evacuated from the support posts, but there was no formal ceasefire, and these evacuations were often conducted under enemy fire. At 10 a.m., the Germans launched their most effective attack on the defensive line, targeting the area to the southeast with ground forces and recently arrived Tiger tanks. This attack penetrated the defenders' outer defenses and posed a threat to cut off the majority of the division from the river. Fierce counter-offensives by the defenders and concentrated artillery fire from the south of the river eventually drove back the Germans. Urquhart developed the withdrawal strategy based on the approach used during the Gallipoli evacuation in the First World War. The units on the northern edge would retreat first, moving past the more southerly groups who would follow them. The glider pilots would arrange the routes to the river, and the operation would be supported by heavy artillery fire from XXX Corps. To maintain the secrecy of the operation, the strategy was not revealed until the afternoon, and some men, mainly those wounded, were ordered to stay behind to provide cover fire throughout the night. The troops were instructed to silence their boots and weapons to evade German infiltrations into the defensive area. Heavy rain started by 2100, which helped disguise the withdrawal. The artillery bombardment began, and the British forces started to retreat towards the river. The Germans attacked the retreat, mistaking it for a supply effort. At 5 a.m., the operation was halted to prevent the Germans from accurately targeting the boats with their artillery. A total of 2,163 airborne soldiers, 75 Dorsets, and several other individuals were successfully evacuated, and 95 individuals lost their lives overnight during the evacuation. On the morning of the 26th of September, the Germans intensified their assaults and cut off the bridgehead from the river. It wasn't until around noon that they realized the British forces had withdrawn. The Allies retreated from the southern side of the Rhine, keeping their position on the island that lay between the Rhine and Vaal rivers. The Germans launched a counter-offensive in October during the Battle of the Nijmegen salient, but were defeated. The front line in that region stayed unchanged until after the winter. The bridgeheads over the Maas and Vaal rivers acted as a crucial base for attacks on the Germans. The battle resulted in a heavy loss of the British and Polish troops, so much so that the 1st Airborne Division never recovered from the losses it suffered. 3/4 of the division's forces were unaccounted for upon their return to England, with 2 out of the 3 brigade leaders, 8 out of the 9 battalion leaders, and 26 out of the 30 company leaders of the infantry missing. But despite being outnumbered by the German forces 3-1, the British paratroopers bravely stood their ground in the Battle of Arnhem for 9 days, which helped the Allied forces in other areas to make gains against the Wehrmacht.